Recording.
Hello. So I'm here today with Dr. Bonnie Stelmach, who is a professor at the with the Department of Educational Research Studies at the University of Alberta. And so, welcome, Bonnie, and thank you so much for being here with us today. And you recently concluded some research that was titled "It Takes a Virus: What Can Be Learned About Parent-Teacher Relationships from Pandemic Realities." Wow. And you began this during the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic when the schools here in Alberta went into emergency remote learning. And so that has set the stage for your research. And so I just sort of want to take us back to when this first happened. And so, as a professor at the University of Alberta, when the closure of in person classes happened, this must have really impacted your students and your teaching. And so, do you recall your initial reaction and thoughts and experiences from that time?
Thanks, Brandi, and many thanks to you and Wendy for championing this research and to the Alberta School Councils Association for supporting it, because it was a real occasion to learn. Certainly when lockdown happened in March 2020, I think it was surreal for everybody. So similar to the K-12 system, we were not prepared for the extent of emergency remote teaching that was about to happen. One of the things that was different, I suppose, for the university is we didn't have the spring break that kind of naturally fell for a lot of school authorities to take a bit of time. And I know some decided to give an extra week for the teachers to prepare. We had like a weekend or 4 days or something like that. So for me personally, I've been fortunate to have experience with online teaching. So I've designed courses and I've instructed them. So I kind of know the gig. That helps a lot. I know I had colleagues who really struggled because they hadn't had that experience. And it takes an incredible amount of time and resources to put together an effective online course. It's not something you throw together in a weekend. So I know that there was quite a range in reaction and performance and setup for the students. And I know even with fall term, knowing we were going into online, that's continued because even with a summer available, we didn't necessarily have an amount of tech support to help people who would have no experience at all. So quite a challenge. I personally, because I've done online course creation and teaching, I know the value of it. And I was surprised once I got into it, I'd say 4 or 5 years ago when I kind of took the leap and tried to go in that direction. It's surprisingly helpful for your face-to-face teaching. You're much more intentional. And so it really improved that. So I was okay with the switch and knowing that we were going that way in the fall and now the winter as well. But I know that I'm not necessarily the majority.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think that it is, and just because of the difference in the ages and the experiences of the students, right? There is that huge learning curve that many of our students who were in the K to 12 system experienced around, personal responsibility and technology use. And so, so I can appreciate the difference and the challenges for each set, though. So thank you for sharing. And so, at what point during the spring 2020 pivot to remote learning for Alberta students, as a result of the pandemic, did this research idea emerge for you?
I have a niece who's a teacher. I have teacher friends, my neighbor that we walk our dogs together. So I have my pulse on the school community pretty much all the time. It didn't take long to realize that there was an incredible expectation for parents. Even though it wasn't home education, it certainly felt like that. Especially parents of younger children who wouldn't have experience with the technology. It was surprising to learn how shy they were with the technology, going on a Google Meet or something like that. So parents had to be really, really hands-on. And so there was just an inevitable interdependence that had to develop. So it seemed like it would be an opportunity missed not to investigate and explore whether or not this made any difference to parent-teacher relations. And perhaps more importantly, did it show us something that had been, concealed before something like a pandemic just blows up our world and makes us realize things that we didn't even think about before. So I think it was May when Wendy and I had a phone conversation, and things were rolling by June. So it's one of those things that a scholar from Australia called their study a rapid response study, and that's pretty much what it was. It's a pretty quick turnaround.
I think that would be a fair use of terms there, because everything is happening so quickly. And I think that that we have the unique, if we're going to look for positives in this, right, we have the unique opportunity to really analyze the situations that are happening directly because of this pandemic, which is why I think that this particular survey is so important. And so when we look at this, you have devoted a substantial portion, if not all, of your academic career to studying parent experiences in schools. And so how does this research project compare in terms of response rate, array of perspectives, and richness of data related to some of your previous work?
I'm a qualitative researcher, and so I typically work with really small samples. That's the virtue of it. Individual interviews, you're not going to talk to 100 people, not in a short time frame anyway. And I've done research across 4 provinces in Canada, but I'm pretty localized in my research. So what's different about this study was that I used a survey for the first time, and also individual interviews. But so it's a much bigger data set. Survey has the advantage of being able to capture much more perspective. The reach is just wider. And so it gave obviously a richer data set with lots of variance and perspectives through the comments that were offered. The interviews afforded me a chance to drill down, because the limitation of survey is that the comments are not necessarily self-explanatory, and you obviously will interpret it in some way, but you don't necessarily know. One that stands out in one of the questions, in terms of, what were some of the positives that emerged? And it was a comment, I could still see it on the page. I loved it. And it's kind of an outlier, right? But what was it that the parent loved? Was it the fact that they got to be home with their children? Was it the fact that they got to be really directly involved in the curricular aspects of their schooling? Was it that they just decided that's the end of schooling and we're just going to focus on other things? And that was kind of a relief. I mean, we really don't know. So it gives me a chance when I sit down with a parent or a teacher to kind of throw out some of these things and look at the patterns and say, what do you think this means, right? Especially when there might be contradictions, et cetera. So I think the survey was really, really interesting for me. I've got stacks of data with sticky notes everywhere. It's a lot to keep in mind. And typically with a qualitative study, 10 participants is about the point where you reach saturation. And in other words, you start to hear the same thing. And so you can sort of draw it to a close. And there definitely are patterns that emerge in this data, but lots of contradiction too. I mean, at one point, my research assistant, who I'd also like to acknowledge, Rita Lau, who's a teacher and a mother and a doctoral student, we did a bit of looking at the data together at the beginning. And I said, I've just never worked with such disobedient data, where it's just, there are comments that are kind of, they fall into one theme, if you will, but then you see almost as many kind of comments and patterns noting the opposite of the theme. So it's like, I don't know how to make sense of this. It takes a lot longer. That's one of the things I learned. It was a little bit overwhelming at the start. With a small data set, you can almost hear the voices back from the interview. It's not so possible to do that with 5,600 survey comments. Yeah.
Well, and thank you for helping us understand that there's going to be such a broad range of experience and perspectives when something like this is happening. And I can even say for myself, whenever I filled out the survey, I was trying to pinpoint exactly what it was that I wanted to share, because there were definitely, it was a roller coaster of experience that was happening. I have 5 children, across different grades with different learning needs, and then also my husband is a teacher, and so our every aspect of our life was suddenly so deeply impacted. And so I think that it's important that we acknowledge that it's not going to look clear cut for every single family across the province, and that's why I think it's so important that the people who participated made sure that we were able to capture the variance that people were experiencing in the education system. So thank you for that. And so our organization often talks about how parents are partners in education, and we are partners. We're partners often with our teachers, and that relationship is sacrosanct. It is so important to the health and success of our students. And so, in the pulse point section of your report, you refer to the heartbeats and the hearts of parents and teachers. And so, those are terms of compassion and empathy and humanness. And so, I'm just wondering what compelled you to use those terms?
Well, thank you for highlighting that kind of language, because that was indeed the intention of it. It's, I'm drawn to metaphor, and I do believe it's a powerful rhetorical advice for connecting people. And when you do have kind of this range of perspectives, and as you already aptly described, the experience for yourself can change throughout the day. This is just such a unique experience that we've been thrown into. And so in a report of this nature, it's typical to preface the data findings with an executive summary. And I felt that was a little bit clinical for this moment. I mean, COVID is a virus, and I wrote in the report, it's a scientific fact, but uh, it's a moment in our social existence that has been unparalleled, and let's hope will remain that way. So it's I think instead of executive summary, Pulse Points really maintains that this is an interpretation of human experience. And one of the things that happens when you read data is that you get drawn into a story, admittedly partial, even when you're sitting down with someone and having a discussion through an interview. Um, but it is a human story. And in the data, there were heartfelt comments. It takes a vulnerability to make certain statements, to admit to things like, this was hard for me. This was really hard for my family. We struggled with mental health, which has been quite a common theme. And there were heartbreaking comments. I can see on the page one, it's at the top of the page, and it's quite a lengthy quote where a parent is really disclosing the extent of the struggle. And so when you read things like that, you can't help but feel the data. And so it's not just a summary of things that I found in terms of, a scientific element to this study. It's really a chance to say, this is an explication of the human condition during this particular time. And so one of the very first interviews that Rita and I conducted was with a teacher, and he said, I think what this highlights is that we're too hard on each other, and parents and teachers need to exercise care and compassion. And that was a great way to start, because it set the tone, I think, in terms of thinking about the research process in terms of data collection, but then most importantly, how the data get analyzed. And so, I've argued before that we throw out these terms like partners, right? Partnership. Parents and teachers are partners in education. And because it gets so popularized, we take it for granted. That's just the way language works, right? And so I think we're very well intentioned with that kind of language. And then we throw in adjectives like authentic partnership, meaningful partnership. And at the base of it is relationship. And it doesn't matter what kind of conference I'm at. You throw out that statement that it's all about relationships, and everybody's nodding. We all know. But what is it about the relationship? Because arguably, when a parent and a teacher lock horns and find themselves in a situation of conflict, that's a relationship. It isn't what we aspire to. But so some of the inspirational and aspirational language that populates the discourse in terms of the parent-teacher literature and certainly the practice needs to be unpacked a little bit. And so studies like that give us an opportunity, but the relationship is the heart of it, right? And when there's good, effective relationships going on, there is a meeting of the heart, not just the mind, right? And when there's conflict, there's heart's intention, right? Not ill will, just heart's intention. I think so. There's the strength and the fragility in every relationship. And so, you know, parents, children, those are emotional investments. Teaching is also an emotional investment. So they're both in the same game, perhaps in different places on the game board, if you will. But it's the human condition that comes to the surface when we think about the relational element of parents and teachers working together. So that's a pretty lengthy response to that question, but I'm pretty passionate that we make research accessible. And for me, accessible means, where do we find the heart connection, right? I really do hope parents will read this, or at least some of it, and feel that there is compassion for the treatment of the data itself, not just that we have compassion for each other.
I think that was a very wonderful, in-depth dive. And I have lots of things I wrote down, but one of my favorite things is an interpretation of the human experience. And so that language is so important. You're right, because whenever you're looking at data, it is very clinical often, but there's people behind that. There's real lives and real students behind that, right? And so it is so important that the language that you used captures the human experience. And also, relationship knows no hierarchy. And so whenever we have these relationships and these partnerships, often especially in times of conflict, it's easy to default to the title and the role and the expectation as opposed to the relationship. And so that was something that I found really interesting in some of the summaries, was just how, there were opportunities where the relationship came to the forefront as opposed to the role. And so, yeah, so thank you so much for really humanizing the data, because that is incredibly important. And we often talk about language, at school councils, and how language is impactful. And so, whenever you're looking at, results review, and you're talking about students and the way that things are working for students, sometimes if you change that to children, these are our children.
Mhm.
Just that gentle shift in language reminds people that these are not just numbers on a sheet, these are our babies. And this is why we're here, right? We're so invested in these babies of ours. And so I think that you did a brilliant job of shifting the language to keep the humanity at the forefront. And so thank you for that. And so before we wrap up, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think is really valuable that we share?
Wow, there's a lot in there. I think what I appreciate most about what I've learned the most about the parent-teacher dynamic is that it really is difficult to boil it down to, here are 3 strategies, here's a blueprint. Because even when we say it's about relationship, there's a lot of assumption that's wrapped up in that. One of the things is that we're all expert at relationship. We know that is not true. We try our best, but a lot of it comes from self-awareness too. And when you throw people into a scenario like this, we all have a range of coping mechanisms and resources available to us. But how it hits us is not always known until it happens, right? And it's really easy to judge. I saw judgment by parents of teachers and by teachers of parents. And that was probably the most interesting thing that because I think in the research, the certainly there would be a lot more finding of how teachers position parents in certain ways. And typically there's a binary. There's the involved versus the uninvolved, and it's based on presence. And one of the things that was very clear is that parents were really craving that visibility of the teacher, not for them per se, but for their children. And so the same kind of binary emerged. Well, there were the teachers who really put in an effort and really worked hard. And they had their regular Google Meets, so they were always calling or always in contact. And the ones they didn't hear from, they just assumed had disengaged, and that wasn't necessarily the case. So it was kind of beautiful in a way to level the playing field in that way. But then it says something important to us, like presence matters. So going forward, what do we do with that? Because we cannot have the expectation that all parents come to the school, that all parents volunteer, that they get involved in those ways that have become, kind of sacred for schools, but inevitably leave some parents out just because they aren't in a position to do those kind of things. So how then do we think about presence without requiring those particular kinds of behaviors and responses when the school's inviting? So the jury's out on that, right? But I think one of the things that the study does bring to the surface then is that the idea of connecting matters. And it might not be enough to do so via a digital communication. And it might not even be enough to have that, once or twice a year parent teacher conference. And that's not to say start investing all kinds of energy on getting people together, because people don't have time for that. So it's super tricky. But open a conversation, right? Ask parents, what is going to be the best? What does make them feel connected? And I've learned that through other studies I've conducted as well, right? Because I think that engaging parents means creating a sense of belonging, which doesn't have to be physically in the school space. You can create that in other ways. But how to do that, I think, is still a question that we have to wrestle with.
Thank you for that. And I think that again, it goes back to your language, because um, we often do operate in the binary of an engaged parent or an involved parent, and that lens definitely shifted to teachers in a different way in the spring and even now, because parents are watching their children learn in their own homes, and so it's not just this lens of we're hearing from our child what their day was. We watch it unfold. And so whenever we as parents, you want the very best for your child, right? So you really want that the connectivity is what's important, right? So the connectedness. And so again, it goes back to that language, and we talk about this with school councils. You want to engage, you want to authentically engage your parents, but also connect, right? Because connections are so vital to relationships and to success for students. And so you use that language interchangeably, which I thought was quite beautiful, because that is the goal, as parents who volunteer or parents who participate or parents who are involved and engaged in their students' learning experience, is you want to have a connection point, not just so that you're supporting your student, but you're supporting the school and the staff that help your kids. So your language was so important there. So thank you for that. And thank you for this opportunity, for parents and teachers across the province to participate in this survey, in this study. This is fantastic work. And thank you for your time today. And so with that, I just want to say, take care, stay soaked, stay healthy, and you are valuable, and the work that you do is so very valuable. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. The pleasure is mine, and I really appreciate the opportunity.